In earlier videos, we've seen that brain aging is a major factor for health and longevity. With that in mind, how can we optimize brain health? To address that, today's guest is Dr. Tommy Wood, whose new book, The Stimulated Mind, dives deep into future-proofing our brain to stay young at any age. So with that, welcome, Tommy, and let's get into the presentation.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And I'll take you through this presentation, but jump in at any time, ask any questions, and we can go from there. So just a brief overview. I'm an associate professor at the University of Washington. I work with a variety of digital health and charity groups looking at dementia prevention, so Food for the Brain in the UK and Better Brain here in the US. And I also do some work, sort of elite sports performance, primarily with Formula One drivers through a company called Hints at Performance. But today we're going to focus on keeping your brain young over time. So, many people will have seen some version of a graph like this, um, where you have age on the x-axis here, performance on the y-axis on the side, and lots of different ways that we can measure and track different aspects of cognitive function or cognitive performance. So you'll see that the majority, probably kind of decline on average in the population from the sort of 30s onwards, thinking about things like processing speed, different aspects of executive function like working memory, reasoning, response inhibition. But some functions do stay relatively stable, particularly those that come under the banner of crystallized intelligence. So the knowledge we have of the world, how we integrate that into sort of the bigger picture of things, and something that people might call wisdom may actually even increase into our 60s and 70s, and beyond. However, we do tend to think of cognitive function like this, both individually and as a society. We know that we build it early in life, but then somewhere around maybe our mid-20s, early 30s, we assume it's just this unstoppable decline that we can do nothing about. And maybe if we're particularly unlucky, and we do think of it often as luck, we may cross a threshold for what we call dementia, which is essentially a clinical diagnosis of somebody who's lost enough function that they're no longer able to look after themselves on a day-to-day basis. And if we think about what we can do to affect this trajectory, often we just think about how we can make it worse. For instance, every time we're stressed, we don't sleep enough, we have a few too many cocktails and kill a few brain cells, we kind of think that we're just accelerating this process and there's nothing we could do to move it in the other direction. Luckily, that really doesn't seem to be true. So, in reality, each of us has a wide potential for modifiable cognitive function, really across the entire lifespan. So, even though like where this band is on some kind of a quantified scale, each of us has this wide set of possibilities. And if we put the right environment and lifestyle factors in place, and maybe appropriate use of medications, etc., to address risk factors, we can ideally stay towards the top of this band here, and hopefully avoid dementia entirely. We've actually known for a really long time that decline is not inevitable, even though it's something that we've kind of sort of embodied as a society, that we just expect cognitive function to decline with age. I work at the University of Washington, and this study was done out of the University of Washington. This is the Seattle longitudinal study that started in the 50s. And Warner Shai, who set up the study, he brought people back every 7 years to look at their various aspects of cognitive function. And this was really the first time that kind of longitudinal cognitive function was tracked in a large population. And what he found first, if we look at sort of like the average numbers here, so he's looking at verbal meaning, spatial orientation, reasoning. And if you look at people at 60, 70, 60, 67, 74, 81 years old, you'll see that these numbers, as they go up, that's relative decline over time. So on average, people are declining if you just look at the whole population. However, if you look at individuals over time, and that's what sort of these graphs are here, and this paper is now like more than 40 years old, so the graphs are a little, they look a little dated. But here they're looking at relative change over time from 60 to 67, 67 to 74, 74 to 81 in these different areas, so verbal meaning, spatial orientation, inductive reasoning. And then this is the percent of people who either improved over time, and there are some people who are improving in every bucket, or stayed the same or got worse. And so what you can see is if you look at those who either improved or stayed the same, in every bucket that adds up to more than 50%. So on average, the majority of people, more than 50%, were maintained stable cognitive function from their 60s into their 80s, which is not necessarily what we would expect. And these data were actually used to raise the retirement age in the US in the 1980s because they sort of showed really for the first time that it's certainly very possible to maintain cognitive function, well into your seventh, eighth, ninth decade. So, with that in mind, we've now also seen over the last decade in particular a big focus on the ability to prevent dementia from happening. So I like this quote from the first edition of the Lancet's Commission report on dementia prevention, run by Professor Jill Livingston, where they said that it's never too early and never too late in the life course for dementia prevention. And many people may now have seen some version of this figure here that comes. This is actually from the more recent updated version of that report from 2024, where they looked at 14 different modifiable environmental factors and estimated what proportion of dementia could be prevented if we eliminated each of these either individually or entirely. And so, we have educational status, hearing loss, LDL cholesterol, depression, traumatic brain injury, physical inactivity, diabetes, smoking, hypertension. So many of these really related to lifestyle. They estimated that at least 45% of dementias may be preventable, but there's actually been quite a lot of discussion since that this could be a conservative estimate. And there were like letters sent to the Lancet because there were certain risk factors that were not included in this report that actually we have some pretty good evidence for. So including sleep deprivation, diet quality and nutrient status, in particular, omega-3 fatty acids and B vitamins. I'll show you some data on that later. Late life cognitive activity, which we know is important, and then things like oral health as well could certainly known to play a role in dementia risk. And so others using other data sets have estimated that maybe even 70% or more of dementia may be preventable, though at this upper end, a lot of that's related to sort of societal, socioeconomic factors that would require kind of big societal shifts in addition to just individual lifestyle change. So this is another way of looking at some of those risk factors. This was done by Professor Yinchai Yu, who actually published that paper suggesting more than 70% of dementias may be preventable. And here you can kind of see a variety of risk factors. So anything above the dotted line increases risk of cognitive decline and dementia. Anything below it decreases risk. So here, I mentioned things like late life cognitive activity. We know physical activity and a healthy diet are important. And then things that might increase risk, alcohol intake, head trauma, we've got high blood pressure, smoking, diabetes, elevated homocysteine, so as a marker of B vitamin status. So these are some of the other things that we might need to think about. However, when we start to take all of these risk factors into account, we end up with these very, very long lists of things that we need to address. This is taken from this is a very sort of like well-evidenced list taken from a relatively reputable source on social media. And you can actually see very similar lists in sort of published studies like this from one of the Lancet journals. However, when we have all these big lists, it kind of makes it tricky for us to figure out how these different factors fit together, where we should start, how we address personal risk. So with these big lists, there are other things that sort of come to mind as well. Like we're assuming that each of these things are linear and can be addressed sort of one by one and they stack on top of each other, even though we know that many risk factors interact. And I'll show you a little bit about that later. And there's no sort of hierarchy and framework for how it all connects. So this is some work that I've done as well as with some colleagues to try to kind of sort this out into a framework that we can apply to sort of implement these risk factors and hopefully address them in the individual. So our possible solution is what we call the demand-driven theory of age-related cognitive decline and dementia, which comes with a catchy acronym. But in reality, sort of a simplified version of this is why your brain is like your biceps. And I'm going to make that case And hopefully that gives us a framework to work from when we're thinking about preventing cognitive decline and dementia. So this figure comes from a paper that I published with neurologist Josh Turknett a couple of years ago, outlining this theory. And essentially, the idea is that, like pretty much every tissue in the body, the brain's function is determined by the demands or stimuli placed upon it. We can think about bone, skeletal muscle, liver functions, immune function. All of these are driven by stimuli and challenges of various types that help to drive adaptation and improvements in function. And we see something very similar for the brain. So there are a variety of different cognitive stimuli that we know increase cognitive function, increase like various aspects of functional capacity, and then also prevent decline. When we apply these kinds of demands, you can do a lot of this, you have to do a lot of this in animal models, but you see sort of this demand function coupling where you upregulate a whole bunch of both functionally enhancing mechanisms, but also mechanisms associated with repair and anti-aging. And that really seems to be stimulus driven, just like we see in skeletal muscle, for example. However, if you stimulate a tissue, you activate some of these processes as the tissue adapts. You need some period of rest and recovery for that to happen in. And so sleep being a critical one, particularly for the brain. So to kind of like you really show how this might work in real life. The example that I have is skeletal muscle, where really we see very many of the same processes going on. So if you want to build muscle, you want to build strength. The most important thing that you need is stimulus. So you need to lift weights. And you lift weights, then you get more jacked. And we can make this a little bit more formal. We can measure function, which is strength. We can measure structure, which is muscle mass. But in reality, the stimulus is what's driving most of that improvement. We can improve our adaptation to stimulus by improving supply of adequate protein, calories, micronutrients, as well as providing the necessary support and recovery processes for that adaptation to occur. But in reality, a lot of it boils down to the fact that if you don't lift weights, then you don't get jacked. And many aspects of brain function seem to be the same. So we've kind of put together this idea that I call the 3S model of interacting factors that determine cognitive function over time. So they are the primary stimulus that our brain receives. This can come from physical activity, cognitive activity, social activity, a supply of energy, oxygen, nutrients required for the tissue to do what it needs to do in order to respond to the stimulus. And then the support and recovery process that allow that adaptation to happen. So this includes sort of trophic support from hormones, neurotrophic factors, as well as adequate sleep and rest, as well as avoiding various exposures that we know impair adaptive processes in the brain. So this is sort of like a schematic that shows that. This is taken from my recent book. But it shows how all of these things interact. And so we know that when you stimulate the brain, that area of the brain activates an increase in blood supply through a process called neurovascular coupling. So it increases local blood flow, increases the supply of oxygen. This is why vascular health is really critical. It increases the supply of energy substrates. Primarily that might be glucose, but it could also be ketones or lactate. This is why metabolic health is really critical. And then also increases the supply of nutrients that sort of allow that system either to be built or sort of to run mitochondrial function to kind of derive energy. When we stimulate areas of the brain, we also directly increase the demand for support processes. So actually stimulating the brain increases sleep drive in that area of the brain that night, for example. So these things are directly coupled. These are not a list of things that you address one by one. They are constantly interacting with one another, which then allows us to kind of intervene at one specific point, and the whole kind of network starts to shift in our favor rather than addressing them one by one. So the reason why, I'm going to start by going over a little bit of the evidence for why I think the function of the human brain is primarily stimulus driven. And this is a pair of really interesting studies that sort of looked at how the brain changes over the lifespan. And on the left-hand side, this is a study done by a group at Washington University in St. Louis, um, and they did two different things. And so in the top row here, these are the areas of the brain that at birth are least developed in humans and then develop the most after birth. And so basically anything that's more yellow is something that is more underdeveloped at birth and develops more after birth. In the middle, these are the areas of the brain that are most evolutionarily sort of evolved or advanced in humans relative to other species or other primates. And you can see that these areas of the brain essentially overlap almost perfectly, and that's what this map below is kind of where these maps overlap. And you can see that the areas of the brain that seem to be most underdeveloped at birth and therefore are largely driven, their development is largely driven by the environment that brain is born into, are those that are most evolutionarily advanced in humans and therefore responsible for some of our most complex cognitive functions. Like here we have aspects of the prefrontal cortex, the lateral parietal lobe, and the temporal lobe. So really areas associated with executive function, language, memory, focus and attention. These are really driven by the environment after birth. Similarly, this other study looked at something very similar, but now in the aging human brain. So which areas of the brain are most susceptible to the processes of aging? And you can see that essentially the same areas of the brain start to light up. And this is not the case with not other primates. So this is a particularly a human pattern of brain aging. And where this seems to align is that one of the theories of aging is the developmental theory of aging, which is that aging is essentially an ongoing set of developmental processes that then drive a loss of function. So when we think about brain development in the first place, from early childhood, brain development involves the pruning of synapses in order to refine connections. It's not actually growth of new neurons, it's refining of the connections and cells that already exist. And so that pruning is driven by the stimuli that the brain receives, which is then what builds a certain set of cognitive functions and capacity. Then, as we get older, if this developmental process continues, which is constantly refining function based on the stimuli the brain is exposed to, we would expect that the loss of inputs over time would drive greater pruning, and then those areas of the brain look like they're aging because we're losing function in areas of the brain because they're no longer being stimulated in a way that built their function in the first place. So that's kind of the hypothesis that we're coming at this from. In terms of a more practical sense, we've seen multiple lines of evidence that stimulating the brain with a variety of different cognitive inputs builds and maintains function over time. So on the left-hand side here, these are data taken from hundreds of thousands of individuals who took a variety of cognitive function tests. And what you see is that depending on the level of educational attainment, so starting from some high school at the bottom up to PhDs at the top, you can see that the greater or the higher and the later the peak of cognitive function based on level of educational attainment. And, essentially suggesting that the more time we spend as professional learners just applying stimuli to the brain as our sort of primary daily practice, this builds capacity over time. And therefore we have a higher peak, but also that occurs later because we're investing more time in that process. And this is after taking into account things like socioeconomic status and access to education, which obviously would be a big confounder here. However, we know that education helps to build early capacity, but that doesn't necessarily change the trajectory of cognitive decline later in life. So this is kind of an example, a figure taken from a meta-analysis looking at this where, on average, those with higher education have higher levels of earlier cognitive performance, but the rate of decline is similar regardless of your level of education, unless you do something else here in this period of time. So yes, those who have higher levels of education tend to be diagnosed with dementia later because they're coming from a higher starting point, but you still need to have some kind of activity here in order to change the slope of this trajectory. So as an example of that, and where we probably have some of the best evidence comes from the work environment. So these are data taken from a big meta-analysis that looked at populations in the US as well as across Europe. And they looked at two different things. One, level of educational attainment, was that high or low? And then a level of cognitive stimulation that came from work. Highly cognitively stimulating work was work that was considered to have a lot of demand. So a lot of demands on time, social demands, skill development, problem solving, but that you had a lot of control over those demands. And what you can see is that those who had high educational status and high cognitive demands at work had the lowest risk of dementia compared to those who had neither. But if you had one or the other, you also had a lower risk of dementia overall, which suggests that even if you didn't have a high degree of early life education, you can still make up for that with cognitively stimulating activities later in life. And other studies have looked at this in other ways, looking at the sort of repetitiveness or the monotony of the work environment. And so the more complex and less repetitive your work is, again, the lower the risk of dementia and the slower the rate of cognitive decline over time. We can see these changes with novel cognitive inputs actually happening within the brain. We can build or change brain structure associated with changes in brain function, even after that sort of period of time where we thought that the brain stops developing. So maybe after the mid-20s to early 30s. It was probably the first study to show that. This was published in Nature now more than 20 years ago. And they took adults and they taught them how to juggle. And then they looked at how brain structure changed on an MRI scan as they learned how to juggle. So they learned a three-ball cascade. So that's just a standard juggling maneuver with three balls. And where they particularly saw changes in the structure of the brain were in the visual cortex at the back here. And so here they have the first MRI scan, like before they started to learn how to juggle. Then they looked at increases in gray matter in the visual cortical region after 3 months of juggling, and they found that bigger changes were seen in those who got the biggest improvements in juggling skill. But then, really interestingly, they had them stop juggling for another 3 months, and they scanned them again. And just like you lose muscle mass and strength if you stop training, those changes in the brain started to recede as the stimulus was removed. So this is really the brain adapting to inputs and functional requirements over time. We know sort of similarly that when it comes to complex skills, the most important contributor to how those skills are maintained is the practice or the ongoing sort of input of maintaining those skills. So this is a study done in a variety of pianists, looking at amateurs and experts and those who are older and younger. So the younger ones were 20s and 30s, the older ones were 50s and 60s. And they looked at them in two different types of cognitive tasks. So one was a general processing speed task called the digit symbol substitution test. And what they found was that on average, the younger people performed better than the older people, which is kind of what you'd expect. We know that age affects processing speed. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second, because that's also trainable. But we also know that general health can influence processing speed, things like blood pressure, blood sugar, other aspects of nutrient status, and that's something that I've published on previously. But when it came to skills-related tasks, so complex piano-related skills, what they found was that, yes, the experts did better than the amateurs, but the younger experts weren't any better than the older experts. And the primary driver of function in these complex skills was how much practice that person had done in the preceding years. So even later in life, you can maintain high levels of complex skills if you're continuing to practice them. The final example that I have here, this is one of my favorite studies of all time, looked at taxi drivers in London. And they've actually done several studies in this group because of this huge amount of learning that they have to do in order to become taxi drivers. So if you want to be a taxi driver in central London, you have to pass something called the knowledge. The knowledge means memorizing this map here. It's 25,000 streets in a 6-mile radius around Charing Cross Station in central London. The idea being that a passenger jumps in to your taxi anywhere in this circle, tells you where they want to go, and you should be able to navigate there without consulting a map or GPS. Um, the This takes about 3 years to learn. And in one of the studies in this group, and so they were mainly in the sort of mid to late 30s. um, they followed them for 3 years and they did MRI scans before and after. So they looked at those who trained for the study and passed. They looked for those who trained for the study, trained for the test and failed. And then they had a control group as well that they followed for 3 years. And what they found was that those who trained and passed the knowledge test had significant improvements in the structure of the posterior hippocampus, which is really important for spatial memory and spatial navigation, but no changes in either those who failed the test or the control group. And there are now a few studies that have looked at dementia risk in taxi drivers and ambulance drivers who have to do a lot of navigation. And they have the lowest sort of age and socioeconomic status adjusted risk of dementia of pretty much any occupation, potentially because of this like constant stimulation that the hippocampus is receiving as part of their jobs. At the same time, as I kind of alluded to, we know that if we start to remove stimuli, then we start to lose function. So this study here looked at the areas of the brain that are most affected through social isolation. So they kind of aggregated data from prisoners who are put in solitary confinement, from like NASA studies looking at social isolation or solitary confinement as part of like future travel to Mars. They need to know how people will respond to just like being on their own in a capsule for months or years on end. And then also polar explorers, so people who are like just on their own trekking on some far-flung part of the Earth for several months at a time. And what they found was that the same areas of the brain that I mentioned earlier that are, particularly susceptible to the environment in development and aging, sort of they pop up again. So here, prefrontal cortex, lateral parietal lobe, lateral temporal lobe, and just to kind of, really show that, here's rate of change or sort of atrophy of the brain in individuals with Alzheimer's, and again, you're seeing these same areas of the brain kind of pop up. So, removing stimulus, and this time social stimulus, seems to be driving aging in certain populations in those same areas of the brain. We know that other inputs, when we lose them, can increase the risk of dementia. So there's been an increasing interest in loss of hearing and loss of vision, and that was actually included in that Lancet report that I mentioned earlier. So we also know that this is reversible. So in those who are at high risk of dementia who get given hearing aids with hearing loss, so like age-related hearing loss, like presbyacusis, they see a significant reduction in the risk of dementia. This was not a randomized controlled trial, but there's an observational study looking at cataract surgery. So those who had cataracts and got cataract surgery had a significant risk of a decrease in the risk of dementia compared to those who had cataracts and didn't get cataract surgery. And I thought it was interesting that the effect size was actually very similar to an additional 4 years of education, which we know is protective against at least age at dementia diagnosis. Similarly, there's a large body of evidence that shows that cognitive decline tends to accelerate at retirement, which is when we sort of lose the primary cognitive and social inputs that we get on a day-to-day basis through our work. So I did mention that one of the things that we lose with age is processing speed. And we have some very interesting recent evidence that suggests that we can train processing speed, and that then decreases the risk of dementia long term. So these are data taken from probably the biggest study of cognitive functions across a population and ages. It was 1.2 million people did this was an implicit bias test, and they looked at aspects of processing speed and reaction time as part of that. And what they saw is that on average, processing speed tends to increase until about the mid-20s, as we would sort of expect. Then it remains relatively stable over time until about 60, and then it starts to decline. The Then like I said, there's some evidence that we could potentially intervene on this. So and we could do this through brain training. The best brain training study done to date was actually one of the first big brain training studies. It was the active study, which was done in the mid 90s. And it took nearly 3,000 people in sort of their 60s to 90s. And they split them into four different groups. So there was a control group, and then there was three different brain training groups. They did 10 training sessions over 6 weeks. And then there was a booster session at 1 year and 3 years, and then they followed them up now for at least 20 years. And sort of the three different training groups were memory training, where they learned mnemonics and things like that to help them remember. They learned another group learned reasoning training, so this is looking for patterns in numbers and letters. And then the final group was a processing speed training group, where they were sort of given a screen and they had to recognize pieces of information and remember where they were, with them being flashed up in very short intervals, so hundreds of milliseconds. And then it was adaptive. So the better you could do at it, the shorter the interval got, or the shorter you saw the information for, to kind of train people to be able to process information more quickly. This is now included in the Brain HQ brain training platform, and the specific task is called double decision. And what they found, in this very recent paper now published earlier this year, was that those who did the processing speed training, including the booster sessions at 1 and 3 years, but it's really not that much training, right? It was just 6 weeks plus, a few sessions 1 year later and 3 years later. They had a nearly 20% reduction in the risk of dementia over the following 20 years. There have been some other follow-up studies that have looked at like what's happening with this type of training, and it seems to be improving cholinergic signaling in certain aspects of the forebrain, which we know is susceptible to the processes of aging and is lost as people enter, particularly Alzheimer's disease. So it seems to be having like a direct biological effect in an area of the brain that's susceptible to the processes of aging. However, I don't think that we need to do, just processing speed training or brain training, because there's a variety of different things that we can do that can help improve the structure and function of those areas of the brain that are susceptible to the processes of aging. So this is another very nice paper that was published in Nature Communications last year called Creative Experiences and Brain Clocks. And what they did is they looked at a variety of data sets, looking at those who are amateurs or experts in creative arts or creative fields. So they had tango dancers, musicians, visual artists, video gamers, and then they also included a randomized control trial where they had people learn to play a video game and looked at how that affected the structure of brain networks. So they primarily did this with EEG, so looking at the connectivity in different networks in the brain associated with certain functions. And then they did like a kind of a biological age of the brain using the connectivity of these networks. And they found that the most important network for predicting brain age was the frontoparietal network, which is really important for things like focus and attention and initiating the processes of memory encoding. And then they found that based on a level of expertise in one of these different skills, the younger people's brains looked, the more structurally intact the networks in the brain were. And these networks are those that seem to be susceptible to the process of aging. So basically, the process of learning complex skills seems to maintain the function of these areas of the brain. So we've kind of talked about building capacity in stimulus, but we know that there are going to be a whole host of lifestyle factors that are going to influence then how our brain responds to a given stimulus. So we might also think about how lifestyle and the environment can push out the period of time before decline, meaningful decline starts to happen. So here's an example of a paper kind of summarizing those again from one of the Lancet papers. And you'll recognize some of these factors from what we mentioned earlier. So insomnia, physical inactivity, hyperlipidemia, poor glycemic control. We know that drugs, smoking, and alcohol play a role. Blood pressure, a significant risk factor for cognitive decline and dementia. So if we can start to address these, we can improve functional responses and adaptations to cognitive stimulus. So as an example, just to kind of go through some studies to kind of look at these individual risk factors. On the left-hand side, these are data from the Rush Memory and Aging Project, looking at the rate of cognitive decline, in the same individuals over time. and based on their cardiovascular risk. And you can see both global cognition, which is sort of average cognitive function over multiple tests, as well as individual tests like episodic memory or perceptual speed or processing speed. You can see that the higher the level of cardiovascular risk based on blood pressure, blood sugar, blood lipids, etc., the faster the rate of cognitive decline over time. Similarly, these are data from the English Longitudinal Study of Aging, where they again looked at individuals over time based on their level of HbA1c. So those who had a normal HbA1c less than 5.7 compared to those who are pre-diabetic, compared to those who had type 2 diabetes. And what they saw was that as you went up those sort of classifications of blood sugar control, the faster the rate of cognitive decline. We also know that physical activity is significantly protective, can actually increase cognitive function even late in life, as well as then protect it over time. This graph is taken from a meta-analysis that just sort of looked at physical activity more broadly, and essentially estimated that there's a linear effect of most levels of physical activity and any kind of physical activity on cognitive function. And they estimated that if you're doing sort of the WHO level of recommended physical activity per day, you actually will get a clinically meaningful increase in cognitive function compared to not doing any physical activity. So this kind of has a time times intensity sort of effect. So if it's lower intensity, then you need to do more of it. If it's higher intensity, then you need to do less. So 5 minutes of interval training a day, for example. But in reality, it's sort of like a total dose response. The more the better, and the more intense is sort of like the faster you can get, or more efficiently you can get those benefits. But we know that different types of physical activity do actually have different effects on different parts of the brain and different cognitive functions. So cardio, in particular, seems to benefit the gray matter of the brain, so sort of like the wrinkly outer part of the brain that you can kind of see here, as well as the hippocampus sort of in here, which we know is critical for memory function. And I think one of the first studies that showed this was published by Erickson in PNAS now sort of 15 years ago. And they had older individuals do a brisk walking program 3 times a week for 12 months. So 40 minutes, 3 times a week, brisk walking. And they saw a significant increase in hippocampal volume on an MRI scan compared to like a standard sort of 1 to 2% loss per year in this age group that you would expect in the control group. With that, they saw improvements in memory function. And they estimated that there was sort of this direct correlation between the amount of growth of the hippocampus and the amount of improvement in VO2 max or cardiovascular fitness. So basically, as fitness improved, there seemed to be a correlated increase in hippocampal volume. We also know that intensity does have an effect here. So a more recent study, now published last year, randomized adults of a similar age to 3 different groups. They had a low intensity group, sort of walking and stretching. They had a moderate intensity group. These were doing sort of like zone 2 type work on a treadmill, sort of 40 minutes 3 times a week. And then they had a high intensity interval training group who did the Norwegian 4x4 protocol. So on a treadmill, 4 minutes, 85 to 95% of maximum heart rate, a 3-minute break, 4 times round. They did that 3 times a week for 6 months. And what they saw, and then they looked at memory function over time and up to 5 years after the end of the intervention. And what they saw was that there was a significant improvement in memory function, in particular in the high intensity interval training group. And this benefit was retained for 5 years, even though after 6 months they went back to their previous levels of physical activity, which wasn't that much. So this is an incredibly impressive and durable effect of high intensity interval training in this group. Interestingly, the VO2 max improvements, so fitness improvements between the high intensity interval training group and the moderate intensity interval training group weren't that different. So a lot of this seems to be driven by the intensity of the exercise above and beyond just the direct effects on fitness. And I think a lot of that is related to release of lactate, which increases the production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor in the brain, which we know is critical for maintaining hippocampal function. By comparison, strength training seems to be particularly important for the white matter of the brain, which sort of like sits in the middle of the brain and is important for things like processing speed and executive function. So these are data taken from the brain power study. This was done in postmenopausal women, but there are other studies that were done in men that showed the same thing. But they had them do strength training once or twice a week for a year. Um, and then this is after a 2-year follow-up, and here we're looking at executive function, which is kind of related to white matter structure. And you see that even 2 years after the end of the intervention, you have significant improvements in executive function in both the once a week and twice a week training group compared to the control group. So again, we're seeing significant improvements in the structure of the brain and associated improvements in function with resistance training. And we, a group of us, reviewed some of the evidence around the structural changes of the brain associated with strength training in this paper a couple of years ago. Finally, we know that there's a potentially additional benefit from coordinative type exercise, or what we might call open skill exercise, in sort of like the sports science world. So these are sports that, in addition to a physical component, have some kind of coordinative component. So we're talking ball sports, team sports, martial arts, board sports. And there are lots of studies now, randomized controlled trials, where if you compare two different physical activities that have the same level of physical sort of challenge, the same sort of cardiovascular demand, those both are beneficial for the brain, but those that have you layer on a complex motor component as well, like badminton compared to cycling or dancing compared to circuit training, you see greater improvements in the complex coordinative activity group. So these are not data on cognitive function; these are actually data on mood. But this is a nice recent meta-analysis looking at different types of physical activity and reduction in symptoms of depression. And you'll see that many physical activities have a clinically meaningful benefit, so they sort of pass this dotted line here. But dancing seems to have the largest effect size, and there's actually lots of studies that show that dancing also improves cognitive function in older adults. Importantly, and I think we've kind of touched upon this a little bit, but importantly, it's never too late to start to improve physical fitness. These are data taken from the Hunt cohort in Norway that looked at change in physical fitness in people's in their 50s and 60s, and they found that the greater the improvement, particularly down sort of at the bottom right here, in physical fitness measured as VO2 max in that time period, the lower the risk of dementia. Whereas if you lose fitness, your risk of dementia increases. So that's physical activity. Then the next sort of important bucket that we talked about here was sort of in that you're thinking about the 3S model, thinking about supply. Physical activity plays a big role in cardiovascular fitness and vascular supply. Here, we're thinking about nutrient supply. And we know there's a variety of nutrients where the nutrient status is associated with later dementia risk. Many of these you can see here. So folate and B12, omega-3s, vitamin D, zinc, iron, choline. These are some of the ones that we have some of the best evidence for in terms of long-term risk of dementia. So as an example, these are just data from a couple of meta-analyses. So on the left-hand side here, we have vitamin D. We know that those who are deficient in vitamin D have a significantly increased risk of dementia. On the right-hand side, this is now anemia, so low levels of hemoglobin. This is often related to iron status, though could also be related to B vitamin status, or other aspects of chronic disease. But we know that those who have anemia have a significantly increased risk of dementia. We also know that these nutrient status factors interact and stack on top of each other. So there are now multiple studies that have looked at vitamin D and omega-3 and B vitamins and iron, and you see that as the number of deficiencies increases, you get sort of synergistic increases in the risk of later dementia. So another example that I kind of mentioned briefly earlier is B vitamins and omega-3s. And we know that low B12 in particular is associated with brain atrophy and dementia. This is often seen sort of in parallel with increases in the marker homocysteine, which is a measure of the requirements of B vitamins that relate to methylation status. So B12, folate, B6, and often riboflavin or B2 as well. And there are now several randomized controlled trials that show that brain atrophy and rate of cognitive decline are slowed with B vitamin supplementation. Um, the on the left-hand side, both of these graphs are taken from probably the first study to look at this. It was the VitaCog study that was run out of the University of Oxford by Professor David Smith. And here on the left-hand side, you can see all the different areas of the brain that were positively affected through B vitamin supplementation in individuals who had elevated homocysteine. So this was a homocysteine above 13. And these are areas where atrophy was slowed with B vitamin supplementation. So we're basically looking, throughout the brain, but in particular, many of those same brain areas that I've talked about several times. But what's interesting is that they found there was an interaction between B vitamin status and omega-3 status, whereby the rates of change of brain atrophy was only decreased by B vitamin supplementation in those who had good omega-3 status. So if you had low omega-3 status, then B vitamins didn't seem to do much. And actually, there are now at least two other randomized controlled trials that have showed the same thing, the Omega-AD trial and the B-Proof trial. Both showed that there's an interaction between homocysteine and omega-3 status, and supplementing with one, if you have poor status of the other, doesn't result in any benefit. But if you have both, then you see significant benefits. I just told you about that. So this kind of finishes that kind of supply bucket that I was telling you about. So now we get into this area of support. How can we improve and allow for adaptation in the brain to occur? So sleep is obviously a critical one. We know that sleep has multiple roles in brain health, neuroplasticity, adaptation, metabolic waste clearance through the glymphatic system. We know that poor sleep quality and quantity influence cognitive function and dementia risk. And in the short term, we also know that sleep deprivation does things like changes our emotional state. So it decreases empathy. It makes us have more negative emotional responses, makes us more likely to interpret somebody else's intentions or emotions as negative, and can impair sort of decision making around lifestyle choices. So it has both short-term and long-term effects in terms of our ability, in terms of our cognitive function, our social interaction, and then long-term in terms of dementia risk. We also know that stress can impair adaptation processes and increase the risk of dementia. So here are data from a meta-analysis looking at stressful life events and dementia risk. So they looked at things like death of a family member, divorce, financial problems, health problems, or any kind of chronic subjective stress, and that significantly increased the risk of dementia. And what was particularly interesting to me is that, and I think we now have more data than shown here, is that perceived stress has the same relationship with dementia as, quantifiable sources of stress. So what that means is that when we feel stressed, that increases our risk of dementia. If it's chronic, even regardless of where that stress is coming from, it's really the physiological response that's driving a lot of this. And we can see that through studies that look at allostatic load, so like the total physical, societal, social, psychological stresses that we're exposed to. And so this is a recent paper looking at allostatic load in the UK Biobank. And in reality, we think that we know what some of the mediators of stress and allostatic load on dementia risk are, because allostatic load really seems to drive changes in metabolic health that then would impact brain health. So very often, high allostatic load looks a lot like metabolic syndrome. So you see increases in blood sugar, you see increases in blood pressure, higher waist circumference, changes in lipid status, as well as increased CRP or inflammation. We tend to see lower vitamin D, higher smoking, higher alcohol. So like all of this comes together, but you see that those who have high allostatic load tend to have a significantly higher risk of dementia over time compared to those who have low allostatic load. And this seems to be mediated largely through like the physiological and health effects of chronic stress. A final couple of things that we can think about in this bucket. It's probably no surprise to anybody that smoking increases the risk of dementia, increases inflammation, directly affects vascular health. These are data from a meta-analysis that where they basically found there was a linear effect between amount of cigarettes smoked and risk of dementia over time. Um, the effect of alcohol seems to be slightly more nuanced. There are certainly, ideas out there currently where like any amount of alcohol significantly increases the risk of dementia, but that's done by some very weird Mendelian randomization studies that don't really seem to work for alcohol intake. But when you actually look at physical amounts of alcohol intake, what you see is that if you're drinking up to 1 UK unit a day, and 1 UK unit is about half a US standard drink, so 2 or 3 drinks a week, doesn't seem to be any effect really on brain volume or dementia risk. But once you start to be consuming more alcohol than that, then these are sort of a linear decrease in brain volume as well as an associated increase in dementia risk. Um, as I mentioned earlier, we know that different, more risk factors can interact. So one risk factor for dementia that people have become increasingly interested in is air pollution, particularly PM 2.5, so 2.5 micron particles released, by traffic and other things. But we may be able to protect against that with other lifestyle factors, and this is important because not everybody can move away from the roads or whatever that they live near. Although there are some interesting recent data showing that you can improve certain aspects of health if you're exposed to a lot of air pollution by just having an air purifier in your home. There was a recent study that showed that those who had high exposure to air pollution, they got air purifiers in their home, and that significantly reduced their blood pressure compared to a sort of a sham air purifier. But in this study, this was actually done here at the University of Washington. They looked at air pollution exposure and risk of dementia. And then they found that the risk of dementia was only increased in those who had poor B vitamin status, so folate, B12, and B6. But in those who had higher exposure to air pollution but had good B vitamin status, they didn't seem to have that same increased risk of dementia. And this is thought to be because air pollution may drive an increase in homocysteine, which can be mitigated if you have adequate B vitamin status. So, we've kind of talked about all these different, various factors that play a role here. But, kind of thinking about how these might then be enacted in a given individual, we have several randomized controlled trials now showing that small changes across multiple areas can significantly improve cognitive function, even in older adults. The first trial to really show this was the finger trial. It's performed in Finland. It's now more than a decade old. This was recently repeated in the US with the pointer trial. There was a fully online version of something very similar done in Australia called the Maintain Your Brain study, which found the same thing. That if we address individual risk factors in people at risk of cognitive decline and dementia, we can see significant improvements in cognitive function even late in life. So here we saw people in their 60s and 70s. And so in the finger trial, they had counseling around diet. They had a strength and aerobic training program. They had brain training, online brain training, and then cardiovascular risk monitoring. And then medications or whatever were needed to address cardiovascular risk. And over a 2-year period, they saw significant improvements in processing speed and executive function compared to a control group. You will notice that the control group also got better because as people do more of these tests, they just tend to get better at the test. But even taking that into account, the intervention group tend to do much better, and the pointer trial found something very similar. So kind of the final point here, kind of to take us all the way and round things out compared to what we saw at the beginning, is that we know decline doesn't have to be inevitable, but nowadays we think that decline is so inevitable that people who don't decline are thought to be unusual. So nowadays we call people who retain midlife cognitive function into their 80s superagers. And so if you think back to the Seattle longitudinal study, technically more than 50% of that group would have been considered superagers because they maintained cognitive function from their 50s into their 80s. But now we think it's slightly unusual. The superagers, and there are several studies looking at superagers around the world. There's a group at Northwestern in the US, but there's also a group in Spain who have a cohort of superagers they've sort of looked at in multiple different ways. But superagers tend to have half the rate of brain volume loss per year. Earlier, I mentioned it was sort of like 1 to 2% on average. Here, it's 1% or less. And you can kind of see this is the change in gray matter volume over time in superagers compared to typical adults. And here's where you're seeing some of those changes. A lot of that through the white matter of the brain that we kind of mentioned earlier. So, like, what do superagers do? And this is taken from one of the studies where they looked at a whole bunch of different factors in superagers compared to a sort of a matched population. And this graph looks at the p-value for different risk factors. And so basically, the lower, the better. So we've kind of expanded out the graph here. And basically, what you see is that superagers maintain. Oh, sorry. Superagers maintain physical function. They stay cognitively engaged through reading and midlife hobbies and activities. They sleep, they maintain social connection, and then they look after their physical health. So they avoid things like prediabetes and hypertension compared to a general population. And this seems to be a big reason why they're maintaining cognitive function late into life. So again, all those other things that we've already talked about. However, kind of as I alluded to right at the beginning, if you're sort of looking at all this information and wondering where to start, I think that you're looking at this model and identifying areas where maybe you've got some work to do, and knowing that these different factors interact, you can just start to make small changes, small improvements, maybe in sleep or physical activity. Particularly as we get older, I think stimulus becomes more important as we lose that through work, and then knowing that it's going to have a knock-on sort of domino effect in these other areas. You can start in one place, and the whole sort of network shifts in your favor. If you are interested in reading all about this and all the different science, all the science behind it, this is my book that came out last month. The reference list is more than 2,000 studies, which is fully online, easy to search and access. All the studies are in humans, so it's really the stuff that we know works. But I'm sure, Mike, that you have plenty of questions, so I think we can kind of dig into those now.
That was great. Thanks, Tommy. One thing that I like about your approach is you're like the opposite of the stereotypical scientist. So besides being, a real life scientist, and I say that like as if I'm not in the same boat, but uh, you know, you've got that stereotype where maybe they do a little bit of exercise. You're in this hardcore in the gym, right? Like this is a part of your DNA. So you're
Mm.
actually practicing what you preach, which is a rare thing in the field. You ask most scientists for, well, what should I do? I have all this information. They really don't know because they don't live it, right?
Yeah.
So with that in mind, I think you're uniquely suited for many and most, and probably all of the questions that I have, including how much additional ROI in terms of brain health and slowing brain aging and avoiding, minimizing dementia risk would there be if, so you've already got the education box checked off and lifelong learner checked off. I mean, I don't imagine this will ever turn off for you.
Yeah.
So, and then you've also got the exercise box checked off. So that those two are probably going to be a constant for a long time in your approach going forward. So how much additional ROI on brain health and aging would you get by adding in, if well, this is a separate question, but adding in skills training or video games or you know, is that enough of the foundation where
Mm.
you really don't need some of the other skills training, or how do you look at that in terms of the overall?
Yeah, I think in reality, if I look right, I'm at the top of that education graph, and I also have a very cognitively stimulating job. I'm probably not going to get much extra by, learning languages or musical instruments or things like that. Um, right now, I think that what I've sort of seen with the variety of people that I've sort of worked with, interacted with, is that people like us or similar, maybe some of the clients that we work with, right now, stimulus is kind of taken care of, right? They've done the education, they have highly cognitively stimulating jobs. For that group, the risk really comes at retirement. And there's even some evidence that those who have higher levels of educational status have more rapid declines at retirement because you're removing like this critical stimulus that's been maintaining function. So I think that the best way to sort of manage that trajectory is as you near retirement, that's a time to start building up other skills, other learning opportunities so that you can maintain that even after you've stopped work. So like that's kind of how I think about it. And it would be better that you have a little bit of a run up, maybe 5 years, where you start to do a little volunteering, and maybe you do travel more and learn some languages or learn a musical instrument or something like that. Learn a learn new sport. Pickleball is a great example, right? Everybody loves to do it. I think that's fantastic. And then that kind of smooths that transition out of work.
All right, but that's what the average, this is another thing I like about your approach is, unfortunately, I don't have this DNA where the stuff that I'm talking about and, the biomarker tracking and personalization, this is not for the average person, or maybe it's not for the average person in 2026, maybe for the
Hmm.
average person in 22, 26.
Yeah.
Your approach basically spans the full spectrum where, the recommendations that you just made are basically for the average person who's going to retire at some point and then picking up some skills training, but you also work with the high achievers, right?
Mm.
So this, for whatever reason, or not for whatever reason, but this is more my niche,
Mm.
so like what are there specific things that you're doing now in order to, besides, all the exercise training and obviously deep diving into,
Mm.
PubMed studies, are there things you're specifically doing for the potential long-term gain on brain health and minimizing dementia risk?
Yeah, so the main things that I do, obviously, like other aspects of that of the kind of model like come to the forefront. Like I think I'm pretty good on the fitness, strength kind of areas, um, making sleep as much of a focus as possible, as big, always been a big thing, for me. And then the other big, and then I also, my house is relatively close to a main road, so we've got air purifiers throughout the house. That's like a really easy, like, set it and forget it kind of thing. Um, and then just addressing individual risk biomarkers, right? So I track my vitamin D, track my homocysteine. I have very high LP little a genetically. So then probably need to take really good care of my cardiovascular risk, other like modifiable aspects there. Maybe hope that some of the new medications coming to market, in future will be, relevant and accessible to me. But that's probably a lot of what I do: track blood pressure, vitamin D, homocysteine, other aspects of cardiovascular risk, make sure that my HbA1c is good, fasting insulin is good, those kinds of things. Because now, as I sort of get into my 40s, now's really in midlife is when that kind of risk starts to accelerate. So that's where I'm sort of keeping a close eye on things.
Yeah, that's another great part of your approach is that you're actually thinking about biomarkers and actually looking at biomarkers as, it's what's under the hood. You've got to optimize the what's under. All right, but before going into the biomarkers, I'm still on the things like, brain connectivity and potentially adding ROI. So, and I was going to ask this later, but what are your thoughts on, and even the limited published literature on things like psilocybin,
Hmm.
the connectivity and the interhemispheric communication, right? It lights up like a Christmas tree, whereas normally it's not like that. So what are your thoughts on, and I'm not pro drugs, I'm not, I'm pro
Yeah, yeah.
science, right? So could that be a potential benefit?
So yes, potentially. The some of the animal research has really been in this area has been interesting to me because, at least some of the studies that have looked at it have suggested that when you're using, like, so psychedelics, of various types, it seems like macro dosing has a bigger effect on neuroplasticity than micro dosing. So, like, if you're going to do it, you need to, like, do it properly. That's, I mean, this is in the animal literature, obviously. I think that still the best evidence is for, PTSD, other sort of behavioral health kinds of issues. Um, and the reason why I say that is, well, that's where we have some of the best evidence, and that's still coming. But equally, if we're thinking about, one of the primary drivers being neuroplasticity, like, I know other ways to improve neuroplasticity without taking psychedelics, right? We know that exercise is one of the best gateways to opening the process of neuroplasticity. So, we don't yet know, like, what's the effect size of, psychedelics versus something like an exercise training program, right? We've already seen evidence that the effect size of exercise training is actually better than many of the sort of standard therapies for certain, like, mental health disorders. That doesn't mean that the medications don't work, right? They're still important, but, it's interesting that, say, SSRIs in depression, we're now appreciating that one of the reasons why SSRIs work may be by increasing BDNF production, so brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which obviously intense exercise does as well. So yeah, I think right now I'm very interested in what's going to happen in the psychedelic research, but I also know that there are other ways into some of those same pathways, right, through some of the lifestyle factors we've talked about.
Yeah, I wouldn't propose it as an either or, but
Yeah.
it's kind of like whey protein plus exercise training versus no whey protein, right?
Mm.
Potentially additive effect of psilocybin plus, regular exercise training.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see that possibility. But my answer right now is I don't know because we haven't really looked at that at the sort of at the level that I would want to.
When you think about the brain as a muscle, even though it's not a muscle, but I get the metaphor,
Uh-huh.
right? And when you think about exercise training, right? So I'm sure your workouts are compound movement focused, right? You're
Mm.
not just going in there and doing 10 sets of bis and tries. Maybe you are. I don't know.
Sometimes,
Yeah.
I like, like to feel a t-shirt.
I I generally don't do that. I think it's useless. It's not non-functional. It's a waste of time. The compound movements, I mean, but anyway, that's a story for another day. But when you think about that similar approach to the brain, right?
Mm.
So, if your workouts are focused on like the big compound movements and less so on the isolation-based stuff, granted, not the isolation-based stuff such as like single leg Romanian deadlifts, even
Mm.
unweighted, just to you're getting the balance and the flexibility and hamstring, stretching and all that.
Mm.
And that's going to be some cognitive, well, I wouldn't say cognitive, but it's like skills training, right? So it should be good for the brain. So for me, I
Yeah.
see I see some value of adding that stuff like that, and like knees over toes stuff, which is more balance and joint mobility, in addition to the compound movement. So
Mm.
how can we think about that, like with the brain too, where what are the big heavy compound movements of training the brain relative to the skills-based training, which might be smaller levers?
Yeah, I think a nice analogy there is sort of comparing that very directed processing speed training, which we know does have benefit, right, to complex open skill sports, right? So I would argue that one reason why we tend to lose processing speed with age is because we stop doing things that require us to process information really quickly. So we can train just that part, and there is benefit to doing that. We've now seen that from randomized controlled trials. But right, if you play pickleball, right, you're having to process that information rapidly as well, right? You're having to figure out like where's your partner, where's the ball coming from. You're sort of strategizing like how am I going to manipulate my opponent so I can score a point. Plus, you have the physical component, the social component, right, which also has multiple it will activate multiple networks in the brain. Plus, pickleball has a really complicated scoring algorithm, so you're trying to keep track of the score in your head, which has its own component as well. So like pickleball versus processing speed training, I think is that same comparison. So we know there's benefit to both, but I would argue that things like open skill sports, martial arts, ball sports, team sports require you to process information rapidly, so you'll maintain that function. Plus, you have all those other networks and parts of the brain that are being stimulated.
It may seem smaller scale than what you just proposed, but listening to a YouTube video or a podcast on 1.5 or 2x speed, you've basically got to pick it up faster,
Yeah.
right? And the other aspect of that too is see, I just had a brain fart there. Look at that. Wow. It's not just so hearing, right? So hearing, if
Mm.
you if you've got the volume all jacked up, well, you're not actually forcing your ears to have to
Mm.
try to focus on. So maybe there's some I don't know. What are your thoughts on 1.5x and 2x speed and keeping the hearing, the volume as low as possible as potential ways, because that would be more specific, right?
Mm.
Towards, I mean, sure, I can do pickleball, but now that's going to take away energy from doing my standardized workouts, and maybe
Yeah.
performance dips there. So even though I get the overall balance on the brain, you know what I mean? So yeah.
Yeah, so I like I kind of would sort of the first part like I kind of mentioned with the creative arts study, I think you're seeing very consistent effects across a broad range of different types of activities, right? From video gaming to tango dancing to painting. So I think it's spending time truly focused on one thing that is a complex skill gives you that broad benefit regardless of what it is, right? So you don't have to give up your workouts to go play pickleball if you're getting that same kind of stimulus from something else. Um, the I will say that I listen to most podcasts at like 1.5 or 2 times speed, partly because it's not actually because I think it's training my brain better. It's because I just get bored waiting for the people to say something interesting
Yeah.
if I'm listening to it on regular speed. Plus, you can get more, right, I'm listening to it for the information, so I just want to, get it as
Same.
quickly as I
Yeah.
can. But I do think that's a good point because um, if you maintain that, you are maintaining the requirement that your brain is able to process that information rapidly. So it could become an interesting stimulus, just like I'm not sure we have any data on, say, low level volume to to like really force you to pay attention, but there's certainly some data on training with music comprehension. So you're having people listen to music and kind of identify what they're, the different instruments, the different aspects of things that they're hearing, right? And that's then associated even with some improvements in executive function. I think it was in the study that did that. So training yourself to kind of truly listen and discern different aspects does seem to have some benefits. So that could be volume based, but also could be complexity based.
Focus and attention, right?
Yeah.
Because right, that's what you're basically saying. The better
Yeah.
you're able to focus and attention, that could be better for networks and all that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So, okay. So here's the big question then. All of these, diet, exercise, sleep, even just doing some versus none and eating whole foods and sleeping as much as your body will allow, which is a whole nother subject for another day. But
Hmm.
is dementia and cognitive decline inevitable? We're just pushing out the window another 10 or 15 years.
Yeah. I guess the real answer is we don't know because right, if you push the window out long enough, you'll die of something else first. Unless we truly figure out how to halt the processes of aging for an extended period of time. Um, when you look at sort of the data that we have, even of people going out to like 100 plus years, I think if you avoided other diseases and you lived long enough, it's very possible that you're going to get significant levels of cognitive decline. But I would also argue that in those populations, they're probably not doing everything that we're talking about at the level that they could. So yeah, I'm not really sure what the answer is. I'm confident that the vast majority of people can push out that trajectory such that they die of something else first, if they're attending to all these different things. Whether it means that with some unknown, very extended future lifespan, can we maintain brain function, 120, 150 years? I genuinely don't know because we haven't got enough people who've kind of lasted that long.
Have you looked into rejuvenation, regeneration therapies? Are there things that are on the cutting edge, whether it's like, I don't want to say red light therapy sounds so fringe, but it is being studied. And things like, photobiomodulation would be red light therapy, but I think ultrasound has been
Mm.
applied in Alzheimer's patients. Have you looked into the literature, published literature on cutting edge therapies that could be valuable at older ages?
Yeah, so and because my book's called The Stimulated Mind, I do have a very short section on this because I think it's very interesting that some of the most promising therapies, and right now it's therapies for people who are already experiencing cognitive decline, right, mild cognitive impairment or early Alzheimer's disease. So I have a friend and close colleague here at the University of Washington that's currently studying transcranial magnetic stimulation in individuals with Alzheimer's disease, and they're actually seeing short-lived but definite improvements in cognitive function by stimulating essentially what they're doing is they're stimulating the default mode network with TMS. But then there's other studies with direct current stimulation, alternating current stimulation, random noise stimulation, and it's these stimulating technologies that I think actually have the most promise of the current sort of future list of therapies. But what they're really doing is they're opening the gates to neuroplasticity. And again, I think that I can do that, right? I can do that by getting you in a tango class, or I can do that by getting you to go and do some sprints, or learning a language. And the processes of failure and learning, that's what really drives neuroplasticity. Plus, that neuroplasticity is directed, whereas right now the stimulating technologies, that neuroplasticity is undirected. You're sort of like opened up the gates for neuroplasticity, but you haven't directed it to a process of improving a specific function. And I think that those studies will come next. Right? I think that's where you'll start to really get the benefit from those is, hey, we've kind of activated the brain. Now let's focus it on processing speed, or let's focus it on, aspects of working memory or responsive inhibition, like to kind of build those networks again, focus and attention. So I'm really interested in those technologies just right now. Again, I would hope that we can get similar benefits through some of the stuff, the activities we've already talked about, if we're just thinking about sort of like the fundamental process of what's happening when we're stimulating the brain.
Nice. So the argument against not against, but the argument in support of it may be inevitable that we're all going to end up with dementia, even with doing all the right things, is if you look at biomarkers like neurofilament light chain
Hmm.
increases during aging.
Yeah.
So if we live long enough, we're going to have levels of NFL, circulating levels of NFL that look like we have ALS, which is crazy. Like without, we probably will have some of the phenotype of, all ALS at those older ages. So uh, which brings us then to biomarkers, right?
Mm.
So mentioned a whole bunch of them like HbA1c, blood pressure, lipoproteins. So is part of the story to further minimize risk? I mean, this isn't just about having like an HbA1c less than 5.7. I mean, if you really get into it, couldn't you make the argument that avoiding even the age-related change up to 5.7, so if you started out at an HbA1c at 5, and
Mm.
then 50 years later it's 5.7, couldn't you make the argument that that increase in glycation over time is going to contribute to some aging rate, whether it's in the vasculature and the brain? So is a big part of the story regular biomarker tracking for all of the things you covered, and trying to discover that personalized recipe to optimize all of those to really slow your aging rate, not just in the brain, but systemically.
Yeah, I think so. And HbA1c is a good example because using a specific threshold of HbA1c to compare you to the rest of the population is actually not that useful. Where HbA1c is useful is to monitor your own changes over time because everybody has their own, red blood cell turnover rate and other things that are going to affect HbA1c. So yes, it's really following that trajectory over time, and that's going to be the case for multiple biomarkers. I think HbA1c is probably one of the best examples. Homocysteine might be another one because that does tend to increase with age as well. But similarly, I would argue that we should be doing that with cognitive function too, because like right now, you only get a cognitive function test if somebody thinks you have cognitive impairment, right? But ideally, what you want to do is track those like core cognitive functions over time. So this is something. So I'm chief science officer of Better Brain, which is this free online brain health platform. It has there is a fully free version that has a full database of kind of brain health interventions with different levels of evidence and kind of an LLM to help you build like a brain health program personalized to you. And then there's also a brain health coaching offering, which is covered by insurance for most people, which includes biomarker tracking and cognitive function testing. Because right, what you want right now is for things like processing speed and executive function, you just want them to be somewhere good in the normal range, right? When I work with sort of high performers, they're always like, I want to be in the 99th percentile of processing speed. I'm like, it doesn't matter. Like that what you care about is change over time.
Right.
But you can only know about change over time if you've got several years of measuring these things and you can start to see when the trajectory changes. So I would argue that in addition to measuring, blood test biomarkers, we should be just getting a good baseline of basic cognitive functions so that we can track those over time and, make sure that they're not starting to wander off, even while that's still in the normal range.
I think the challenge there is, it's good cognitive function tests because you can give the MMSE to someone who's, 80, but I mean, at your age, my age, I mean, it's useless, right? So
Yeah, yeah.
like,
So there are definitely they're hard. They can be hard to get, um, but some of the things like CNS vital signs, Craos, right? They can do these big cognitive batteries. They have normal ranges standardized across a wide range of ages and levels of education and sex and things like that. So I think you can do this, and an MMSE or a mocha is not what you should be doing because it's designed to pick up significant deficits. Whereas you want sort of more core processing functions that you can then track over that are relevant to you on a day-to-day basis and you can track over time.
the thing too about the cognitive training, and I'm going to check it out, betterbrain.com.
Betterbrain.com is the platform that I work with, the brain health platform. Brain HQ is the cognitive training platform.
All right, nice. Hang on. So, it's hard to quantify, right? Because if I do a bench press, I can clearly see sets, reps, 1 RM. But sure, processing speed. I mean, maybe I can. It seems like a harder fish to try to optimize.
Mm.
I mean, granted, you can look at change over time, but you know, reversing that decline for someone who's doing all the things right, it seems like a harder thing to manipulate. I don't know. You would know.
Yes. So in reality, that sort of tracking cognitive function over time, if you're already doing everything quote unquote right, there's maybe there's not much more for you to intervene with. But I think I'm thinking more sort of at the population level. Like if like every time you went to do your annual like visit with your doctor, they did a cognitive function test, then you can start to pick up people who are starting to decline before there's a significant change, and then there's a bigger kind of incentive to intervene, sort of at that kind of population level. But I think you're right that cognitive function is a really hard to test. You know, even the test, the gold standard test, the best test, like you're still kind of it's a very small subset of cognitive functions that don't necessarily cover all the things that you want your brain to do on a day-to-day basis. Um, but I would still argue that, you know, regardless of what level of stuff you're doing already, it's useful to have some kind of baseline to work from. And then, yeah, so for somebody like you, would I make an argument that like you should do brain training? I can't really make that argument because we've already talked about all these other things and stimuli that you're doing to maintain these cognitive functions anyway. But in a population where they're not cognitively challenged or stimulated in this way, is there a simple online platform, something they can easily access at home that they can do that we know is going to give them some benefit? Like, and so like these are the platforms they used in like Finger and Pointer, where you saw significant improvements in cognitive function in older adults over time. Yeah, I think there's definitely a place there. So I'm not necessarily saying that you should do brain training, but it's a really nice option to have for a certain group that maybe aren't getting those other inputs.
Nice. I'm open to it. I'm going to
Mm.
check it out. I mean,
Yeah.
there's like an old gait movement pattern, and then there's an old speech pattern, and then
Hmm.
obviously, being able to like I had a brain fart 2 seconds ago, but I'm always like, man, is this am I old now? Like, is this what it is? Because so anything that can help slow those things down, I'm open to it.
Yeah.
So, all right. So stress is a big part of the equation. Exercise is a big part of the equation, and I think this is also something you're uniquely suited to address because I've heard you talk about it in another podcast, which is great, which is um, overtraining, undertraining, getting the prescription right, not just for physical performance, but potentially for cognitive performance. So I think most people so if you think about the average person, if we get beyond just do something, something is better than nothing, right? When you get into the high achievement category, and not necessarily for a specific sport, whether it's NASCAR, people you work with, or professional sports, which isn't necessarily optimal for health, even though they're going to
Mm.
be highly fit athletes.
Yeah, yeah.
But my perspective is obviously longevity, right? So I want to achieve the highest functional performance that I can while not overstressing my system as a potential means for maximizing health and lifespan.
Mhm.
I don't think most people are thinking about it like that. I think it's just do some exercise and or train every day or do an hour every day or walk 10,000 steps, but they're not thinking about the impact that the stress, exercise is a stressor, right?
Mhm.
And if you do indeed overdo it, quote unquote, then you could actually be shortchanging yourself, whether it's in that functional performance or maybe it's some measure of brain atrophy. So your thoughts on using HRV, resting heart rate guided training, right? With the goal of not just optimizing the physical, but keeping your HRV relatively high and resting heart rate relatively low, which is more likely to be found in youth,
Mm.
and using that combination to titrate the exercise frequency, duration, intensity as a long-term approach for minimizing systemic stress without overdoing and optimizing function. What do you think?
So I think there's definitely some potential benefit there. The studies that have looked at sort of autonomically regulated exercise volume and load haven't really shown much benefit over just like traditional linear or periodized programming. They're over relatively short periods of time, right? Though, like 8, 12 weeks is a typical exercise study. The so I think there's potential for benefit there. But there are some caveats. One being that we know that functional overreaching, which would be associated with a decrease in HRV, maybe an increase in resting heart rate, improves and builds adaptation and function as long as you then create a period of time to rest and recover. So what I worry about is that, everybody's got their wearable or whatever, and then it's like you wake up in the morning and it's like, hey, you should take it easy today. And there are several studies now showing that being told that you're under recovered or being told that you slept poorly, for example, makes you perform worse regardless of how well you actually slept, right? So I worry about using these data. It kind of gets in our heads, it affects our performance, it affects our ability to kind of truly do hard work, which is important. And if we're always trying to maintain, high HRV, low resting heart rate, we potentially miss out on some of the benefits of occasionally overreaching. So I think yes, over time, this is going to prevent the type A more is more people from pushing too hard for too long, and I think that's really important because that's a specific group probably that you and I interact with a lot. But for other people, I think that there's still going to be some benefit of ignoring the HRV occasionally and sort of like pushing a little bit so that you then get bigger adaptations afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. But so the thing is though, the change over time, right?
Mm.
Sure, in the short term, you do a workout, HRV should be lower, resting heart rate should be higher. But if you're not paying attention to that at all, and it's just this mindset of I need to get in the gym today, I need to push,
Yeah.
and then this is potential. Sure, you're going to have the salutary effects of exercise. You're going to have general health improvements, but then that chronic overtaxing the system can't be good cognitively or physically, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm in a rare category of people where I'm using these data over time to guide the workouts, and that's actually crafted intensity, duration, frequency, so that I've increased HRV over time. And this is
Mm.
8 years.
Yeah.
It declines during aging while reducing resting heart rate. So, but then the limitation there is, like you said, sometimes you really do have to push it. But if you push it enough and HRV is chronically now suppressed and resting heart rate is chronically increased, am I doing more harm than good if I keep that up for the next, however many years?
Oh yeah, no. So that's what I mean is that I think your approach is a great one. It's just that there are times when we push hard, but then also have to give ourselves time to recover from that. And you'd expect a rebound in terms of HRV and heart rate. And if you're not seeing that rebound, then obviously you've pushed too hard for too long. So yeah, all those different pieces come into play.
So I didn't see a role of the immune system or even the gut-brain axis in your presentation. So, because obviously the immune system and the infection hypothesis for Alzheimer's disease,
Mm.
what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this might have to be my last question. I have to rush to my next meeting. But so the first thing, yeah, there is some super cool new data on like the shingles vaccine, flu vaccines, decreasing the risk of dementia. And so like in most talks, I would also include those as potential because they're immunomodulatory, they're decreasing periods of like major illness. And we know that in older adults over time, it's not a steady decline. There's a drop every time they have a significant illness, and that's because the effect of the infection or whatever it is itself, injury, but then also the loss of inputs. Right, they're not moving, they're not doing anything cognitively stimulating, so you're kind of losing function in that period, and then not sort of doing the work to recover it. And so I think that plus some of the cool immunomodulatory effects potentially of some of those vaccines, like the shingles vaccine in particular, is very interesting and would certainly be recommended. And then in terms of the gut-brain axis, like I know, like the gut obviously plays a huge role here, but I think the best evidence for ways to improve gut function at the gut-brain axis are the same interventions that I've already talked about, and it just part of their mechanism of action is via improvements in the gut. So not discounting the gut, just knowing that actually we've kind of come full circle a little bit where people are now thinking that really the best way to address the gut brain axis is by improving the health of the host. Improving the health of the host, that's you, improves the physical functional status of the gut, changes the gut microbiota, which then sort of feeds back.
Nice. All right, you got to run. I have so many more questions. I'm looking forward to having you back on the channel at some point or more times at some, points in the future.
We love
So
that.
thanks again, Tommy, and have a great day.
You too. Thanks so much.
Ciao.